Now we're starting chapter 5. So here's one copy. Here's a second copy. Here's a third copy.
Should I follow up with my question?
Oh yes. We'll start with your question. Yeah.
Take these two.
This is a new.
There's a new handout. This is it, right? This is okay.
Is this yours, Rabbi Gottleib?
What do you mean?
This hat case?
This what?
It is.
Hat case?
Yeah.
Oh, okay.
You can put it back.
Very nice. No, it's
Okay. Yeah. Oh yeah.
perfectly seated here.
Okay. Fine.
It's called the hat is the beautiful hat.
Yeah.
But that's the name.
It's only the case. Anyway, let's get back. Let's get to work. We're late. So remind me what your question was. Say it again.
We were talking about how,
Oh, really?
this line of if someone can't do something perfect, like you mentioned, how some people, they do the prayers like a week in advance, or even a month leading up to it, waking up early, or going to the night, like the night from the morning. And the premise of the question was, if we can't reach the perfect expectations within the text, what is that middle ground from trying and not trying?
Okay. So now, let me sort of generalize the question. People come to yeshiva. Many of the people who come to this yeshiva don't have a strong background. Let's say you put in the required 7 hours a day. You learn a lot. And it's very easy to get overwhelmed because it's all new. And the amount of new information and the amount of new responsibilities is absolutely overwhelming. And the underlying thought is, well, the Creator created me, and He gave me my abilities, and He gerrymanders my experiences so as to lead me in the ways in which I will develop. And He wrote the Torah, so it must be that all the things in the Torah I'm able to do, so I have to do them. But it very quickly becomes overwhelming. And the truth is that the responsibilities are there, and one is supposed to take the responsibility to do all of them, but not necessarily to do all of them right away. Today, it's 6:45. By 6:50, be perfect. No, that's not required. And even though it's a responsibility to do all of them, one can have a legitimate explanation as to why one doesn't succeed in doing all of them, and then he's not liable for any penalties for failure. I'm avoiding the Kantian position for those who know what that is. I'm choosing my vocabulary carefully. But the bottom line is, if you don't live up to all of them, you may not have any guilt whatsoever, because you weren't given the capability to live up to all of them. Let me give you an extreme example. The Vilna Gaon learned 16 hours a day with pure concentration on a bad day. A good day was 18 hours. Now, shall I say, I'm a failure, my whole life is worthless because I'm not doing what the Vilna Gaon did? No, I shouldn't say that. What I should say is, look at who his parents were, and look at where he grew up, and look at where he was learned in yeshiva, and so on and so on. My job is not to be the Vilna Gaon. As Rabbi Zusha said, if they'll ask me after 120 years, why didn't you live like Abraham? I'll say, because I wasn't Abraham. When they'll ask me, why weren't you Zusha? Then I'll have a problem. I have to live up to the capabilities that I was given. And not everyone is given equal capabilities. So the Rambam, in this chapter that we're going to study, says that everyone, because he has free will, could be as righteous as Moses. Rabbi Chana Wasserman said that if I, Rabbi Chana Wasserman, would serve God with all my strength for 1,000 years, I wouldn't come up to Moses' ankles. So what does the Rambam mean when he says that everyone could be as righteous as Moses? Rabbi Chana Wasserman says, just as Moses used all of his capabilities to serve HaKadosh Baruch Hu, and when Moses used all of his capabilities, the result was spectacular, because he was given spectacular capabilities. So each one of us could use all of his capabilities to serve HaKadosh Baruch Hu, and when he does, the result will be according to the capabilities that God gave us. And as far as righteousness is concerned, will be equal, because all righteousness requires is that you use all the capabilities that HaKadosh Baruch Hu gave you to serve him. That's what righteousness requires. Beyond that, you're not responsible because it's beyond your ability. The Ramchal, Moshe Chaim Luzzatto, in the Derech Hashem, in the way of God, says 3 times, your reward will be determined by your effort, not by your performance. And I would say the more superficial explanation of that is, if you gave all your effort, you can't be held responsible or held liable for doing more because you did all that you could. The deeper way to look at it is, all of the effects, all of the outcome of your efforts is a divine gift anyway. Beyond the effort, you have no control over the outcome. You're not going to get reward because God gave you a gift. That's not how you earn reward. And you're not going to be penalized because God didn't give you a gift. That's not something you should be penalized for. So your reward depends only on your effort. In that way, you could be the equal of Moses in righteousness without your performance coming anywhere near Moses' performance. And this, by the way, is the way in which Moses could make true what is said about him in the Torah, that he was the humblest of all men. How is Moses supposed to be humble? Moses get up in the morning and say, I'm really nobody. I'm really nothing. What have I got? I have no good qualities, no accomplishments. I'm really nothing. No, that's just not true. To be humble doesn't mean to lie to yourself. So again, the Ramchal and the Mesilas Yesharim defines humility as not taking credit for your good qualities, not feeling you're worthy of praise for your spiritual accomplishments. Not to deny that you have accomplishments, not to deny that you have good qualities. Humility doesn't mean I'm nobody, but the question is, why am I what I am? How much of it is a divine gift, and how much of it is my own effort? It's impossible to know. Just as we said a couple of days ago, that no one can look into the heart and see the heart. We said that God told that to Samuel the prophet. The truth is, you can't look into your own heart either, because every psychologist will agree on that, right? You don't know yourself. Not that I quote psychologists because they're always right, but in this they happen to be right. People see themselves through a haze of hopes and fears and justifications and self-condemnations. We have all sorts of biases and distortions in perceiving ourselves. So the bottom line is that it's only if. So now when you say, how do I steer the path between, on the one hand, feeling guilty and failure because I don't live up to everything, on the other hand, being simply lackadaisical and complacent, the answer is the way you would in athletic performance. You're a trainee an athletic team. On the one hand, you don't compete now as if you were an Olympic champion. If you did that, you'll break your bones. And on the other hand, you don't simply say, I have what I have, and I'll take it as it comes. You charted an in-between path where you make an effort. If you have good trainers, they'll tell you where to put the effort, how much effort to put. And you'll make these mistakes of both kinds. Sometimes you'll be too strict with yourself. You try to push yourself too hard, the trainer will say you're risking injury. And if you injure yourself, training is over. So don't do that. On the other hand, you're too lazy. I had a personal trainer. I still do. I still exercise. But years ago, I was running 3 miles in a half hour, and the trainer said, I think you should up it to 4.5 miles in 45 minutes. I said, a 50% increase in one shot? I was 60 then. And he said, yeah, I think so. I said, really? He said, well, I don't think you could do it. I did it, to my shock and surprise. I realized I was worn out after the half hour because I knew it's only half hour. So it's all right to be worn out now. You just give it up. No, and I said, no, I'm not finished now. I've got another 15 minutes to go. So I did it. So they know better than you often what you can do, what you can't do. So it's a middle ground. I tell them, when the boys come into the yeshiva and they start having shiurim, I tell them, think like you're an anthropologist. You're visiting a new culture. You're taking notes on what the new culture is about. How much will you apply to yourself? That's a separate decision. That's a separate decision. Even if what you're seeing is something that's ideal. Imagine that you're 15 years old and you're very gifted at parallel bars, and you decide you're going to try to work for the Olympics when you're 21. You're now 15. You look at an Olympic performer's routine on the parallel bars. Do you try to imitate that? No, you don't. What you say is, what can I do to move in that direction? What can I do to gradually develop the skills that will put me in that direction? You don't demand of yourself at 15 to do what they're doing at 21. So what you're learning here now is the information about the ideal. This is the goal to be working for. A goal is not something you require of yourself in the next 10 minutes. A goal is something you can work towards over years. That's how you take a middle ground without crushing yourself with an impossible responsibility to do everything all at once, and without simply discarding it. That's my answer to your question. Okay, you got a question?
You weren't really answered. It was more just about how you can possibly gauge if you're putting in the requisite effort,
So that's a matter of self-knowledge, self-understanding. And let me just add one little thing here. We had prophecy from, let's say, the exodus from Egypt down to the beginning of the Second Temple. It was about 1,000 years. That's one of the questions you could ask a prophet. Prophets help you, prophets give you a divine input into your spiritual decisions. If you had, Rambam says, if you had any physical ailment, instead of going to a doctor, during 1,000 years, says Rambam, no one went to a doctor. You went to the prophet and said, look, I have this physical problem. Obviously, the physical problem is because of a spiritual failure. Tell me what my spiritual failure is so that I can correct the spiritual failure and in that way escape the physical problem. That's called treating a disease rather than treating the symptom. That's how medicine would talk about it. Since the beginning of the Second Temple, we haven't had prophecy. There are lower grades of divine inspiration, but that means typically people live without that knowledge. So that means we have to make estimates, we have to take advice from other people, we have to evaluate, and you can get it wrong. There's no guarantee you're going to get it right. So your job is to do the best you can, to ask HaKadosh Baruch Hu for help, that your judgment should be correct, and then do it. And that's the best you can do. Okay? Chapter 5. Chapter 5 is beginning of the Rambam's chapters on deep philosophical ideas. The whole idea of Teshuva is that you're responsible for what you do, and therefore you have to deal with the consequences. Chapter 5 is about free will. And although free will is a complicated and difficult subject, we'll take a look what the Rambam says and maybe elaborate a little bit. Free will is granted to all men. If one desires to turn himself to the path of good and be righteous, the choice is his. Should he desire to turn to the path of evil and be wicked, the choice is his. Now here in these words, if you pay close attention to them, is a verification of what I told you 5 minutes ago. He doesn't say free will is granted to all men. If one desires to be righteous, he can be righteous. No, it's a much longer description. If one desires to turn himself to the path of good, turn himself to the path. Not just get on the path, turn himself. First, turn yourself. And then by turning yourself, you get onto the path. And then once you get onto the path, then you can be righteous. It means it's a process. It's not an immediate decision. I'll be righteous because I have free will. No, it's not given to you. Becoming righteous is a process. And while you're on the path, you aren't yet righteous. So Rambam here is indicating, there are other places where the Rambam says it even more clearly, but here it's indicating that it is it's a process, and therefore you don't do the end of yourself because you have free will to be perfect instantaneously. This is, as the translator writes, the intent of the Torah statement. Now, I mimeographed this off. I copied this off this afternoon because I forgot to do it before. So you can write on it what I tell you. He's giving a translation of a verse in Genesis. The translation that he writes here is the standard translation in almost all of the texts. Behold, man has become unique as ourselves. Oh, I'm sorry. No, this is good. Yeah, knowing good and evil. Almost. I'll tell you the translation that the Rambam is using. Behold, man has become unique, comma. That's where the comma belongs. And instead of as ourselves, it should be from himself, knowing good and evil. The word in Hebrew is mimenu. Mimenu can mean as ourselves, or it can be as from himself. Mimenu could be singular. Behold, man has become unique from himself, knowing good and evil. That's how he translates the verse. And as he says in the guide, he's copying Unclus Hager's translation, who was 1,000 years before the Rambam, 900 years before the Rambam, and who was a convert to the Jewish religion, and he wasn't a Spanish philosopher. So don't blame this on Spanish philosophy. Now look at how he describes what it says. I.e., the human species became singular in the world, unique, with no other species resembling it, in the following quality. Man alone has the following quality, that man can, on his own initiative, with his knowledge and thought, know good and evil, and do what he desires. Man can, on his own initiative, the Hebrew doesn't really say initiative, from within himself, with his knowledge and thought, know good and evil. That's a gigantic statement. It means the knowledge of good and evil is planted in the human being from his own development. It means he could know good and evil, as he says in the guide, with more detail, without having it revealed to him by any prophet. It doesn't have to be written in the Torah. The Rambam says, if your mind reveals to you that something's good to do, when you do it, you'll get a reward, even if no prophet ever said you should do it. And if your mind reveals to you that something is bad to do when you do it, you'll be punished, even though no prophet ever prohibited doing it. You can know some actions are good and bad. I'm going to qualify this in a second, but you can know good and evil from yourself, and you are obligated to follow those understandings, that knowledge. Now, this, he says, is part of free will. So free will is not just taking orders. And this idea that you can know some things on your own that are good and evil is also used in classical Jewish writings, which make the following argument. Why am I obligated to keep the commandments? What rule is there that tells me that I have an obligation to do what God commands? And one answer they give to this question, often given, is that you owe God a lot. You have a big debt of gratitude to God for His creating you and sustaining you and giving you all your resources. And since you have that debt of gratitude, when he issues a command, there's a moral responsibility that you have on the basis of the gratitude to do what he wants you to do. I'll give you just an illustration of how this morality comes into place. Imagine the following scenario. George is drowning in the river. Peter jumps in at great risk to himself and pulls George out. George says to him, Peter, you saved my life. If you ever need anything, call on me, because I owe you. You had saved my life. Okay, 2 weeks later, Peter calls up George and says, I need to borrow $5,000. Simultaneously, a neighbor of George's says to George, I need to borrow $5,000. George thinks, I have exactly $5,000 to loan. To whom shall I give it? I know, I'll flip a coin. Heads it's Peter, and tails it's the neighbor. Something's gone wrong, hasn't it? Peter saved his life. George owes Peter a lot. Could he really just flip a coin? And if the coin falls tails, he'll give it to his neighbor? That would be morally wrong to do that, because he's not taking account of what he owes Peter for saving his life. Okay, so gratitude is a reason which obligates someone, the recipient of the benefit, has an obligation to the giver to do for him what he wants, within limits. I don't mind that within limits, that's a separate issue. I think that's correct. Okay, now, say these Sfarim. So here, imagine a person coming from outside, and he says, okay, here, I see your system, and your system has in it a creator and a commander made commands, and there's all these rules that your system has to follow. You tell me I ought to do that? Why? Why should I do that? You say, listen, it comes from the creator. The creator is giving you everything. You owe him. Suppose he asks you, all right, I owe him. I have a debt of gratitude. Why should I pay my debts of gratitude? Who says I have to do that? Could we answer him, oh, your debt of gratitude? Easy. It says so in the Torah. The Torah says that you have to pay your debts of gratitude. Do you hear that won't work? Because he's standing outside asking, why should I accept the whole system? You can't use a piece of the system to explain to him why you should accept the whole system. He's asking for a basis for the whole system. So if these writings use gratitude as a reason for being obligated to do the commandments, these writings take your acknowledgement of the obligation of gratitude as standing outside the whole system. It's prior to the whole system. The Rambam's writing here makes that possible, because he says that God creates you in such a way that you yourself know good and evil. That's a very, very fundamental idea. Now, I want to, we're okay up to here? So I want to issue a qualification now. And I think the Rambam took this into account because it's quite obvious. When you decide what to do, you're in a concrete situation and you have various options, and you decide what to do, your decision is based on two factors. One factor is, what are the relevant moral rules? And the other factor is, what are the facts? What are the circumstances? When you see someone making a moral decision, and maybe it's one that you find peculiar, you have to ask yourself, is the reason he's making this peculiar decision because he has different moral rules from me? Or is it because he's starting from a different set of facts, which may be right or wrong, or both? But the fact that he makes moral judgments to me are strange, peculiar, or out wrong, doesn't automatically mean that he has different moral rules. It could be that he has a different set of facts. Let me illustrate this with a brutal illustration. Did the Nazis, who wanted to exterminate the Jews, and not only the Jews, there was a Jewish community which went east and was in Japan for a short while and ended up in Shanghai. And when they were in Japan for some months, one of the Japanese officials said to one of the rabbis, you know, the Nazis hate you. The Nazis aren't dumb. The Germans aren't dumb. They're very smart people. If they hate you, there must be something wrong with you. You know what the rabbi answered? After they finish with Europe, who's next? You are. You're not Aryan either. They got the point. Right? The Nazis weren't content that they should rule Europe and the Japanese should rule the East. The Japanese aren't Aryan. The next war would be to conquer the Japanese and ruin and exterminate them. So, when we say the Nazis had made different moral decisions from us, does that mean they had different moral values? You know, the rest of the world says you shouldn't kill innocent people and kill Jews, and they say we'll kill Jews. Does that mean they had different moral values? The answer is no. And I'll prove it to you. Because the Nazis made up a false story about Jews. Jews are evil. Jews are trying to take over the world. Jews poisoned the wells. Jews owned the banking resources and used them to crush Aryan businesses. Jews owned the communications and the press and all the rest, and used them to assert Jews are trying to take over the world. Which means that the German who's trying to kill Jews is protecting himself against an aggressor. He's protecting himself against an attack. That's not different values from ours. He has a different story. He has a different story about the world. So when you see him doing genocide, that doesn't prove that he has different values from us. It could be that he has the same values. He just has a different story. You know who else did that 100 years before, 150 years ago? The European immigrants to North America. There was what's called manifest destiny. You can Google it and find it out. That meant we are controlling the eastern seaboard of North America. It is our destiny to control it from sea to shining sea. From the Atlantic to the Pacific, it's all ours. That's our destiny. There were other people there, you know, people who were there first. No, they're not human. See those red skins? They're not human. They're just animals. Then we can take their land. If they stand in our way, we can kill them because they're not human. Why did they have to tell them a story that they're not human? Because if they're human, you can't take their land. If they're human, you can't kill them because the values that I live by tell me you can't steal land from human beings and you can't kill human beings. What am I going to do? I'm stuck. I want the land. I don't say, okay, I'll just kill them anyway. No, I can't escape those values. I tell myself a story that they're not human. And since they're not human, the values don't stop me. This shows you that they didn't have different values. But it also illustrates the idea that every concrete moral decision you make is based on your moral rules on the one hand and your grasp of facts on the other hand. Okay. Now, when Rambam writes that God creates us with the ability to differentiate good and evil, what is he talking about? He's not saying we are omniscient with respect to facts. He's saying that we're given the ability to understand the moral rules. Okay, but the moral rules by themselves don't dictate what we should do. The facts also matter. You may have heard that up until about 150 years ago, it was standard medical practice when someone had a fever to bleed him. Use leeches or suction cups to bleed him. Reduce the blood pressure. Maybe that'll help the fever. Doesn't really. That's why we don't do it anymore, right? That doesn't mean they were evil physicians or incompetent physicians. They were using the best medical understanding that was available, which had been on the books for thousands of years. They just got the facts wrong. So the decision was medically wrong in practice, but not because they had wrong medical principles, it's just that the facts weren't available to them. Okay, so now let's ask ourselves, what kinds of facts are really important in making moral decisions? what kinds of facts count? If you knew them, that would have a big effect on the way you think about what you should do and what you shouldn't do. Well, here's a fact that I would suggest as an example of king size, right? There is a creator. And he created the universe and sustains the universe. And he's giving you all of your resources. That's a big fact. If you have that fact on board, that's going to have a tremendous impact on the moral decisions you make. For example, as I said 7 minutes ago, if you have that fact on board and you recognize your obligation of gratitude, you're going to take seriously all of the commandments. And if you don't have that fact on board, then you don't have all the commandments. So when the Rambam says that God creates us with the ability to know good and evil, he didn't mean he implanted within us that fact. What he means is he implanted within us moral rules, like when somebody benefits you, you owe him a debt of gratitude, and if he needs something from you, then you have an obligation to help him. That's a moral rule. Together with the fact that God created and sustains the universe and gives you so much, that has the outcome that I'm obligated to keep the commandments. Maimonides here is only talking about the moral rules. He's not talking about the associated facts. So, but when you see it as the moral rules, it becomes much more realistic. People do have a moral sense. They do have a moral a sense of, at least in general terms, what morality requires. Mm-hmm.
So in a sense, it's kind of like an algorithm. It's like the inputs into the algorithm really matter because it could affect the outcome.
That's a very good analogy. That's right. You know the GIGO acronym? Garbage in, garbage out. That's a computer acronym, right? If you put in lousy data, you're going to get out lousy output because right, the program can be perfect, but you're putting in lousy input, so you get lousy output. So here, I think that's exactly right. By the way, a person who's taught, trained in a society that tells him that God wants him to die for him, and in particular, he wants to die for him by blowing up Jews, may, on the basis of his training, be using normal moral rules because he's been taught that lie, and he isn't given any reason to think it's a lie, and he's following what he believes to be a good path because Jews are threatening the world. You could perhaps criticize his process of assimilating information. Maybe he should be more critical of the information that he gets. But it's not the same as someone who decides, I want your car, so I kill you. So it's not the same at all. At any rate, that's what the Rambam says here, and there are others who agree with him. Ben Nissim, his commentary on the Talmud, in his introduction, says the same thing. Anything that's logical, you have an obligation to do. Non-Jews, who I've mentioned have only about 65 of the 613 commandments, he says, but if a non-Jew can see logically that something's required, he's required to do it. Above and beyond the 65. So that's what the Rambam is saying here. This is one basis of free will. So he says, we have this ability. Now, in the middle of the second paragraph, there is no one who could prevent him from doing good or bad. That is to say, I would write a little softer. God can do what he wants. After all, if God decrees that a person's life is over, he can't do good and bad anymore, can he? Right? Because he's dead. Okay, so I would say there's no one who systematically does prevent him from doing good or bad. Accordingly, when Adam was expelled from the Garden of Eden, God says, lest he stretch out his hand and take from the tree of life. In other words, I don't want him to have from the tree of life. Could I stop him? Sure, I could stop him. I could build a wall around the tree of life. I could make it invisible. I could certainly stop him. But I want him to exercise free will. And since I want him to exercise free will, then my solution, given my priorities, is to expel him from the Garden of Eden. This is a pattern of expression which you'll see over and over again, where the words say something like, well, God had no choice, or God had to do this. And you think, if you stop and think and say, what do you mean? He had to do that. Who's limiting him? Why can't he do what he wants? And the answer is not that something external to him is limiting him, but rather, given God's own priorities, this is the only out that he has. For example, it says that God hardened Pharaoh's heart, you've probably heard this, so that he shouldn't do tshuva, because if he'll do tshuva, as we have said, tshuva is a barrier against punishment. Someone who does tshuva will not be punished in this world or the next world. It's an absolute barrier against punishment. God wants to punish Pharaoh, so he says, I'm not going to let him do tshuva. Well, why not? Why can't God simply let him do tshuva and punish him anyway? Who says that tshuva has to be all-powerful? The answer is, God said tshuva should be all-powerful. That's the way he set it up. That's the way he wants it. Given that he set it up, that tshuva should be all-powerful, if God then wants to make sure he can punish Pharaoh, he's got to stop him from doing tshuva, because he himself wants tshuva to be all-powerful. So when you say he had no choice or he had to, what you mean is, given his own priorities, this is the outcome that's available. Not that there's some power outside of him limiting him. It follows from his own. So God wants free will to work. So he says, there's the tree of life. I don't want to be from the tree of life, but I don't want to paralyze him. I don't want to make the tree of life invisible. So given the way I want the world to run, the solution is to expel him from the Garden of Eden. That's the pattern of thought. So this is this fundamental idea that man can know on his own. Yeah. I'll say one more thing, and then I'm going to quit. This presumes the normal human development. It's sort of like math. You know that 7 plus 5 is 12, because you think about it, you say, yeah, that's right. You can picture it in your mind, and you can see that it's true. Normal human development leads you to that ability to see that. Math and morality are very similar in this respect. Certain contemporary philosophers have made a big deal out of this. I think they're dead right. But then it's possible to so distort and victimize the childhood of a person that he doesn't develop normally. There are supposed to be societies without numbers. They don't count, they don't add and subtract. They have no words for the membership of a group. 16, 104, they don't have it. Similarly, you could have children who, this has actually happened, we know about it, who are so isolated as children, they don't get exposure to language. And they grow up non-linguistic, and when they finally get exposure, let's say at the age of 12, they don't learn a language the way we learn it as first language. That phase of brain development, that window of development has gone by. They learn their languages like a second language. They don't get ever the fluidity that a person has with the first language. So you can victimize a child. You can do it with morality too. You can bring up an environment which is so skewed that he doesn't have the normal human development to develop the moral rules that are really inherent in normal human development. So this idea is that it's a universal potential for people, given that they will develop in the appropriate way. And that's why the vast majority of human societies do have rules. They have very similar rules. When they look like they're different, it's usually because there are different facts behind what they do, not because they have different moral values. Yeah, last question.
When it comes to moral rules, if you talk to anyone who's like really extreme in their beliefs, they could rationalize their belief, and they could say, because of this reason, this is why this makes sense, and anything else doesn't make sense. And then if you really dig deep enough, they can say, nothing matters, and you choose your own perspective and purpose, and this is the one I chose, and I'm planting my feet in it. With that argument, like, how do you rebuttal that?
Just ask him, suppose somebody stops you from doing what you want to do. That's okay? That's his thing. His thing is to stop you. That's all right? I don't think he's going to accept that. All of a sudden, maybe there are rules, that telling people what they shouldn't do.